Struggling writers everywhere can rejoice because this is the musical for you. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insight into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, I am so pleased to have with me today screenwriter Steven Levenson to chat about his latest film, Tick, Tick, Boom. Man, oh man, oh man. I have got to tell you, I absolutely love this film. This is a really hard script to write. That is what you're going to find out in this episode. It was not just a simple musical adaptation from stage to screen. There is a lot of heavy lifting going on in this adaptation when you are taking Jonathan Larson's original work and you are kind of contextualizing a little bit of the way his life went after he wrote this work. And it was by no means an easy task. But screenwriter Steven Levenson makes it seem all so seamless. This is a film and a musical that writers everywhere of all walks of life will enjoy, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. And I was so glad to be able to do this interview, and Steven was so forthcoming about his creative process, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. You know, we just published our winter issue recently, our Dune cover issue, and there is so much stuff in there, and we keep adding to the magazine even after we have been published. Two of the big pieces that we published include an interview with this year's Nichols Fellows, and you could read excerpts of their screenplays, and a huge piece on Star Wars Visions, where we went through translators and we were able to interview the Japanese writers and directors involved with the project to make these very cool animes. So there's a lot going on in Backstory Magazine, and I hope you check it out. You could read us on a desktop or laptop, and you could take a peek inside at our table of contents over at backstory.net. or by looking at us in the Backstory app on an iPad. In case you've never read us before, I hope you test drive us by reading our free issue at backstory.net or in the Backstory app. And if you like what you read, I hope you consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to subscribe, I'm here to sweeten the deal. You could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and it will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. Look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where these Zoom interviews go so you can watch us talk, support my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our conversation with screenwriter Steven Levenson about his latest film, Tick, Tick, Boom. Okay, Steven, it's good to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. And I absolutely love Tick, Tick, Boom. I can't wait to discuss it. But as people know, you have a bit of a storied career. So we're going to really start giving people a sense of who you are, where you come from. And then I'll make a very clear spoiler announcement and we'll get into the spoilers of Tick, Tick, Boom. So you went to Brown for theater and English. At what point did you realize you wanted to become a playwright?
You know, first of all, I'm so excited to be here and to be talking to you. And, you know, I came to playwriting rather late, or it seemed really late to me by the time I got to it, even though, of course, people take much longer. But, you know, I grew up doing theater. I grew up loving theater. I was an actor. I did all the school musicals, all the school plays. I went to college thinking that that's what I wanted to do, was continue studying acting, which I did, in fact, do. Basically all the way through. But, you know, my junior year of college, I sort of discovered playwriting. I had always sort of written and I did theater, but I didn't really think of the two as being two things that I could combine for some reason. I had this strange sense, and I blame this on my high school education, but it sort of always seemed like the last living playwrights were David Mamet and Sam Shepard sometime in the 70s. You know, like True West was the newest play I knew, which was from 1970 something.
Right.
I just wasn't exposed to things that were still happening. And so my junior year of college, I really did get my eyes opened up to all of this new theater that was happening. And that was happening at Brown specifically. There was this incredible graduate program. Sarah Rule was a playwright who had just graduated from there, a bunch of other phenomenal people. And I was lucky enough to find my way to Paula Vogel, who was the head of the playwriting program at Brown, an incredible playwright in her own right. She won the Pulitzer Prize for How I Learned to Drive, and her most recent play was Indecent. But anyhow, she had a seminar, a playwriting seminar that I took my senior year, and I was sort of not sure what I was going to do. I was kind of caught between things. I loved theater, and I had this sense going way back that for some reason acting wasn't for me, that I just wasn't an actor. Like I just felt somehow there was something alien about me and acting. And I think it's because I kind of never loved the idea of interpreting somebody else's work. I always wanted some more authorship, some more ownership. And so I found playwriting, and Paula took everyone in the class out for coffee at the end of the semester to kind of evaluate, what we had done that semester and what our plans were moving forward. And she asked me what I was going to do. And I said, I have no idea. I think I'm going to move to New York, but I'm not sure what I'll do when I get there. And she said, if this is something you want to do, meaning playwriting, I believe that you can do it. And those words were, I sort of steal from that in the screenplay of Tick, Tick, Boom, when John talks about Stephen Sondheim, and he says those 5 words, when Stephen Sondheim compliments his song, he says those 5 words were enough to keep me going for the next 2 years. And that was really my story. Those words from my teacher were enough to keep me going, moving to New York, temping, getting nowhere, meeting nobody, and writing plays on the weekends and whenever I could, and just trying and just feeling like I had something to say, and a lot of dark nights of the soul, when I would go back to that encouragement.
And that's awesome. I mean, literally until you just said it, I hadn't thought of it. I'm a theater geek myself. I went to USC for theater school and film, so I've always kind of straddled those two.
Yeah.
And you're right. Until you just said it, I hadn't thought about it. But mostly in high school and early college, it's classical theater that's taught the most, and there's not an emphasis on contemporary playwrights. Often by contemporary, I even mean within the last decade.
Absolutely.
You're right. It's always off, which is really strange.
Yes.
As we see in Tick, Tick, Boom, and the writers who listen to this podcast working in film and television know as well, there is a lot of rejection just for writing. People always associate it with, it's acting. You don't have the right look. You don't have the right clothes, the right accent, whatever. No, there's just as much for writing, and it's tough. And I'm curious about how you dealt with that. As a young playwright starting out, you just got into it a little. You temped for a while.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I had just remembered for the first time in however long ago that happened. I guess it was like 15, 16 years now. When I had that coffee with Paula Vogel, I said, but what about the rejection? I remember asking her that, and she said, I still get rejections. They're just much nicer now. They're phrased much more kindly.
Right.
And that's sort of the best you can hope for. You do get to a point in your career when the rejections are nicer. But I do think they never stop. And certainly those first few years, you're just sort of, it's almost less like I can't open the door and more like I don't know where the door even is. Like there is no, there's no office in the middle of Times Square that says playwrights wanted, In fact, it feels like the whole world is saying quite the opposite. Basically my goal in New York was to make a living and be able to live there. And so that did require temping. And then like 6 months in, I got incredibly lucky, as often happens in New York and the weird magic of New York, that my roommate worked at Playwrights Horizons, which is an off-Broadway theater.
Right.
And the position of literary assistant had opened up at the very last minute, which was a paid salaried job at the theater, basically reading scripts and doing coverage and seeing things, and mostly reading, though, a lot of reading. And I lucked into that job at just the right time. And so the next 2 years, basically, I spent working in this literary office, which is not dissimilar for people in Hollywood from being in development.
That's right. Yeah. It's a great way for writers to see other scripts, get a sense of the format, and also see what's working and what's not, because you are digesting it so that hopefully by the end, like Neo in the Matrix, you could see the code.
Yeah, that felt like my grad school. And that felt, I was so fortunate to do that. And for a long time, I mean, it was just kind of a magical place. My coworker for a moment was Carly Mensch, she's one of the creators of Glow. But back then we were just these young playwrights who would just sit around and talk about theater, every second of the day. We saw everything that we could. And that was my education, was sort of reading plays all day, going to theater 4 or 5 nights a week, and just seeing everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between. And I think that's kind of one of the crucial moments of being an artist, is that moment when you're just starting out, and really the best you can hope to do is absorb as much as you can. and find your tribe a little bit, look around and say, oh, that's the kind of work I want to do, or that's the kind of work I don't want to do. And
you have to keep writing. I mean, as they say in the film as well, because if you don't, you're just observing. So that's
absolutely. I mean, the weird thing about theater, or what, in a way, this is a luxury maybe, is that you never assume that you're going to make a living doing it. Like that was such a distant idea, that was never my dream, really. It was really just to get my work seen and known. So having a day job was just kind of part of what I expected my life to be. And then, I was really lucky and fortunate to find this. There's a tiny little theater off Broadway called Ars Nova. And it's this crazy place where kind of everyone who's done theater, who's written for the theater in the last 20 years, has somehow found their way into that building. I mean, like Lin-Manuel Miranda was there the year before me, and Annie Baker was the same year as me. All of these writers. Anyway, there was a writers group there called Play Group that had just started. And so I joined that group, and that was a chance to bring in work once every few months and meet other people. And that was really like, those were the things that kept me feeling tethered to being a writer and not just an assistant who set up chairs for play readings.
Right.
Which is hard. I mean, that's the difficult part of having a day job in the industry, as I'm sure a lot of people do and have experienced, is sort of trying to, you're the one doing a lot of grunt work, and you're always embarrassed to say, I'm also a writer. Like you always feel like they know that I'm not really a writer. But so anyway,
it always occurs with writers.
Yes, absolutely.
It's interesting talking about finally being seen. To my memory, your first two produced plays were 2008's The Language of Trees and 2009's 7 Minutes in Heaven.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious, what, if anything, briefly, that you want to encapsulate, what was your kind of learning point from those experiences, getting your work up on its feet, getting it seen, and having that realization that, yes, you are a playwright? Yeah,
it's, I started that play, Language of Trees, I guess it must have been, I think it was my senior year of college, the first semester, and kept working on it as I left. And the way I actually landed my first production is a funny, weird, circuitous story, as all of our stories are funny and weird and circuitous. But basically, the last time I ever acted was in a workshop production of a play called Speech and Debate, which was by Stephen Karam, who just wrote and directed The Humans. So anyway, I was in a reading of that play, and then the play went to New York. I did a tiny production in college, and it was going off Broadway to the Roundabout Theater. And I got to audition. It was the only audition I ever went on as an actor. I use the term advisedly, in New York. And it was for Roundabout, it was for the director, Jason Moore, who had done Avenue Q, who would go on to do Pitch Perfect. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I just thought I was auditioning for this play, and I didn't get the role, obviously. But the producer said, I hear you're a writer, and I'd be willing to read your play if you wanted. And that play was The Language of Trees, and they ended up doing it.
That's fantastic.
And so that's sort of how that all came about. But it was,
But it goes back to that belief system that every writer needs to keep clear in their minds, which is that even in an imposter situation, you have to always remember, if you've written something of value, and not every script is, but people are always looking for it. They're always looking for new content, and they'll give it a read, and hopefully you're giving them something that is polished, not your first draft, that's ready to go. And it's great that when a door like that opened for you, you had a script ready to go.
Well, that is one of the things about being a writer. That's one of the few comforts, I would say, is that, it's the great thing and the terrifying thing is that it really is about the work in a way that acting isn't always. I had so many friends at that point who were also, in their early 20s trying to be directors. And that's an impossible career to break into, because you get those meetings and it's like, I'm having a meeting with you. I don't know if you can direct a play. Versus like as a writer, you have this thing to share with the world, and for better or worse, like that's what you're going to be judged on.
Yeah. You're a Tony-winning writer for Dear Evan Hansen, which I've always loved, and I'm just we could do a whole podcast on it. I've boiled it down to 3 quick questions.
Yeah,
just tell us just if you remember the moment of getting the seed of the idea as a writer and deciding that maybe this could go somewhere, because there's a lot of writers that might have that idea and just I'll put it in the drawer. You know what I mean? Like you never know.
Absolutely. That was such a crazy process because, I started writing that. I met Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, the songwriters, in 2011. And we were sort of in a matchmaker situation with a producer who loved them, wanted to do whatever their next project was going to be. And they really wanted to do this original musical, and they needed a book writer to figure it out with them. I'd never written a musical before, but I was really excited about the idea. Like I said, I acted in musicals my whole life. I loved musicals. And so I met with them, and they had this, it was Benj who had the germ of an idea of, it was based on this real story that had happened to him in high school. A fellow classmate of his had died of a drug overdose. And in the aftermath of that tragedy, Benj had witnessed as everyone in the school suddenly became posthumously this poor kid's best friend. And everyone wanted to claim a connection to this tragedy, whether it was real or not. And the most disturbing part was that Benj, even though he could see that happening, still felt that urge himself to somehow be a part of it. And so that was the idea, was like, we think there's something about tragedy and somebody wanting to belong. And then we just started talking. And it was the great thing about a musical is it is very collaborative. It is the essence of collaboration. And so we came up with that together. That was like endless rounds of talking and kind of getting to this. The core question for us was, why would somebody tell a lie to be a part of something terrible, to be a part of a tragedy?
Yeah.
And that was the aha moment for us. And that's when we kind of landed on this character of Evan. And it's funny, your question of when did we know it was a good idea, because we never did. And it was, I am incredibly grateful to our producer, Stacey Mindich, and to other people who told us to keep going, because it was a bizarre idea for a musical. From the very beginning, people said, I hate this kid for lying about something terrible. This doesn't feel like a musical. There's nothing commercial about this.
Right.
And for some reason, we were young enough and hungry enough to just keep writing it. And for a long time, it was at that same time that I started writing that musical, I started working really full-time in TV as a staff writer. And so for a very, very long time, that musical was just the weird project I did on weekends that everyone in the writer's room. 5 years.
5 years to
5 years
to get
from starting to off Broadway.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, we could do a whole podcast on this, but obviously in 2021, not only did Tick Tick Boom come out, also Dear Evan Hansen came out as a film adaptation, and you adapted your own work.
I did.
And there was some interesting things in which you had to make some changes. There were songs that were cut, which I'm sure was tough. And I think the order was moved of some songs as well. What was it like to go back through and adapt your own work? Was there any lesson that you learned? Because I think it's a pertinent question to going back and adapting Tick Tick Boom.
It's tricky adapting your own work. It's trickier than you would think. It was weird going back in 2019 when I really started working on the script, because at that point in my life, I was married, I had 2 kids. When I started writing Dear Evan Hansen, I was so much closer to Evan than I was to his parents. And now it was the opposite. And so already that was weird. Like it was I had a different perspective and a different way in. But the way that I solved my own anxieties about it and insecurities was to sort of accept that I was doing something different and accept that film is in many ways a director's medium. And, I was working with Steven Chbosky, the director, from the beginning, and it was about figuring out. And in a way, that was what made it freeing and made me able to do it, was that I wasn't, I could let go a little bit of my original thing and sort of hope and trust that already exists. So let's make something else.
And that's tough to have to cut a song, especially on something that you already know works, and to move the order around of
Yes.
songs,
Well, I would say it's very hard to solve problems that you think you've already solved,
right.
which is so much of writing, as anyone who listens to this podcast knows, is solving problems.
Yeah.
And especially in screenwriting and especially in musical writing. And you have these intractable problems that you get to, and you find a way through them. And when you take a song out or you switch the order, suddenly you have new problems. And the temptation is to go, but we did this already. Let's go back to the, and sometimes that's right. And most of the time you've got to attack the problem again, brand new, once more.
All right. Well, my last question before we really dive deeper into Tick Tick Boom is, as you just mentioned, you're a TV writer. You'd written on the Playboy Club, Masters of Sex, Vegas, Wayward Pines, and you were the showrunner of Fosse Verdon, which I absolutely love. And that'll be my question for you is, what was it like to go through becoming a showrunner and running a writer's room? And how did it change your creative habits as a writer? Because that's a major step for a writer to go from being in the room to running the room.
Yeah. What I've learned subsequently, once you go from writer on staff to showrunner, you can go back, but you can never unlearn what you've learned, and you can never unsee what you've seen. And your perspective is totally different on the show. Your responsibility is totally different on the show. And it really is, it's all on you in a way. And you take whatever story problems there are, whatever budget problems there are, whatever, technical problems there are, you're the one who's going to take those home. And so it's a very different experience, I have to say. It's almost a totally different experience, because when you're on staff, it's sort of like screenwriting, where your job is a little bit to bring what you have that's special and unique, but ultimately there is this force, the showrunner in this case, and it's her vision or his vision that you're serving. And so there's a little bit of giving up your ego in that process. And when you're the showrunner, it's the opposite. It's you make all the decisions. And so I would say nothing really prepares you for it.
Sure.
And you suddenly have to do all sorts of things that as a writer, you just never train. Nobody ever taught me how to be a manager. Nobody ever taught me how to.
Right.
Nobody ever taught me how to give notes.
Screenwriting. You're dealing with basic personnel management issues and logistics.
Absolutely. I would say the best training though was, and we could do a whole podcast about this, but when I came up in writing for TV, which was not so long ago, I came up writing and producing my own episodes. And so I would get to go to set, I would get to be in all the meetings, and I learned how to make TV that way. And a lot of writers now, networks are doing these short orders, and they're doing these short rooms where it's essentially like, as a writer, you come in, you write, and you leave. And I know all sorts of writers who've been doing TV for many years now and have never been on a set. They've had many episodes of TV produced, and that's going to catch up to the TV industry, because you're going to have a lot of people who have no idea how to make an episode of TV.
And writers have a little more power in TV, obviously, because they become showrunners and producers.
Absolutely.
But you're right. There's plenty that don't end up on set, and that's great advice. All right. Getting into Tick Tick Boom, because we're going to dive deep, my friend.
Yes.
Obviously, John Larson is best known for Rent, but Tick Tick Boom was his first actual success after struggling for years. At what point did you first become aware of Tick Tick Boom, the musical?
Well, it goes back to college. When my junior year of college, I was in a production of Tick Tick Boom.
Okay.
In this kind of, it was like this rogue production that I did with two of my friends, not even in the student theater, like in the upstairs room of the student theater.
Right.
And we just loved that show. And it was so easy to do. That version of the show, which was put together posthumously, and David Auburn.
That for sure.
Yes. So that 3-person show is so easy to put on. You don't need sets. You need one costume. You need a piano. And so we did it, and it was amazing. So I've known the show for a really long time. Well,
so then how did you get involved with the film adaptation? Because, you have proven it was ripe for it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I found out that Lin-Manuel Miranda was doing a film adaptation of Tick Tick Boom. And I just said, who do I have to talk to? What do I have to do to get in a room with him and tell him how passionate I am about this? And I'm one of those people, and there are so many of us for whom Rent was like the defining theatrical event of my childhood. I saw it when I was 12. I can't remember if I was 12 or 13, but it shook me. And again, going back to that idea of like not ever experiencing contemporary writing in theater,
Sure.
That was a piece of contemporary writing. And I didn't know something like that could exist before Rent, that you could have a show that sounded like the music I wanted to listen to, and that was talking about things that I was concerned about, and things that my parents were embarrassed about. Like all of those things were brand new to me. So I loved that show, and could still probably sing through the score right now, and I won't. But so I was, the idea of not only getting to do Tick, Tick, Boom, and Adaptation, but even from the beginning, knowing that this was our opportunity to do more than Tick, Tick, Boom and tell a little bit the story of Jonathan Larson, or use Tick, Tick, Boom to get at the story of Jonathan Larson, felt like, God, what an honor. And I just would love to be a part of that.
I mean, Lin-Manuel Miranda's a great writer in his own right. Was there ever a plan where the two of you might have written it together?
Lin, and this is why he's so great at what he does. I mean, among other reasons, but he knows what he's good at, and he knows what other people are good at, and he likes other people to bring what they can bring. And from the beginning, he told me, I'm not the kind of writer you are. I don't sit down and write. I have songs and I get the songs out, but the idea of sitting down and writing a scene is not what I do. So that was never really on the table.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
He also starred in a version. Lin-Manuel.
Yes, that's right.
In a version in 2014. Was there ever any talk about him taking on the leading role?
Never.
Okay.
But we did talk about,
because it was recent enough that he had starred in it.
Well, we talked about the fact a lot that like he had been in this off-Broadway production of the show, and I had been in a student production, which didn't feel quite at the same level.
Well, I want to talk about your creative habit for a second. When you sit down to write, how important is outlining to your process? Obviously, your TV training has hammered it into you.
Yeah.
Was that something that just came about for you starting with television, or as a playwright, would you also outline?
Actually, it's a great question, because it did begin with TV, and it was something that I was always loath to do, and I felt like there was something degrading or not. I wasn't being a true writer if I had a plan. I had to sort of find it as I went. That was the way that you wrote, and on every project I ever worked on, I would get to this point at page 15, usually, or 20, where I would go, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea where I'm going, and I would inevitably create what I now realize was an outline. But at the time, I couldn't accept that. And then in TV, I was introduced to this idea of the outline, and realized immediately that this was the most helpful thing I had not used. And now I'm religious about outlines, and I love outlines. To me, the scariest thing about writing is writing. Sure. And there's something about an outline that can trick you into starting the process before you're ready, and you're never ready.
Sculpt unless you have clay, and your outline is your first version of clay.
So that's right. So I'm not really writing yet. I'm just outlining, and that tricks your brain into going there, And so I like long outlines, and I like to kind of use the outline to try to begin figuring out the big questions. I don't like to write bare bones outlines. I write, as anyone who works with me knows, outlines that are way too long and way too detailed.
Are they bullet points? Are they treatment form?
They are outline form. They're like slugs, interior, exterior.
Okay.
But they are. I kind of find myself writing through the scene in prose. Not always, but that's how I can get into it.
And so, this is a different experience for you as well. And I'm gonna give a much longer history in a couple minutes. You don't have to, about the project. This is different from your other projects in which you're creating something from scratch.
Absolutely.
Here you're doing an adaptation. So a lot of writers that sit down with an adaptation do a bit of retconning, in which they're taking the bare bone outline of the original, and then they're crafting their own new version on it, sliding, pasting, cutting, whatever they want to do. Was that something that you did when you sat down to take David Auburn's work and to go forward with it, to start seeing how you wanted it to evolve?
The first decision that we made, I would say almost literally the first decision, was not to use the really great adaptation that David Albarn did, to sort of say that that was its own thing, this 3-person version, and to go back to the source, which was a solo show that John had written and performed himself, variously called Tick, Tick, Boom or Boho Days, at different points in its development. And so that presented a challenge immediately because there was no official script of the show ever. The furthest that show ever got was John performing it for a few dozen people in a few different venues over time. There was never a real full production of Tick, Tick, Boom or Boho Days during John's lifetime. So Lynn and I were fortunate enough to get to go to the Library of Congress with a woman named Jennifer Tepper, who is an incredible musical theater historian and knows that archive inside and knows everything about musical theater inside and out. And she was sort of our spirit guide. And we went there and just sort of madly started photocopying every draft of anything called Tick, Tick, Boom or anything close to being called Tick, Tick, Boom, and then tried to piece together which year each of the drafts was from, because it wasn't totally clear, and then tried to piece together what changes were made from draft to draft, and quickly discovered there's this, because it was a solo show, there's a skeleton there for sure.
Yeah, right.
And there's a story, but it's very bare bones. It's very, it was a concert. And so John was really trying to use the story to get from song to song, which gave us a lot of freedom to reinvent and to reimagine and to kind of shift things around a bit.
So back to your creative habit. When you sit down to write, do you give yourself a page count to hit each day, or do you try and write for a certain amount of hours?
I don't really do either, I would say. It kind of depends on the project. I mean, I usually have a goal, a time goal. So it's like, I want to write this outline in a week. Got it. And I find that my writing, I'm so jealous of the people who write 9 to 5 or just sit down and buckle down and do it. I feel very sporadic. And so a lot of my process is thinking and mulling, and then there are bursts of activity,
No, it's common what you do. There's a lot of writers that do that as well, in which rather than picking a certain amount of hours, you pick a date on a calendar as to when you want to be done by.
Totally.
And of course, like most writers, you probably get more and more manic as that date approaches.
Yeah, exactly.
and grind the axe.
Exactly.
So that's what you do. So when you were outlining Tick, Tick, Boom, how long did you give yourself to get a completed outline?
Well, that was a real, I was fortunate because I knew Fosse Verdon. We were developing it, and it felt like it might happen in the writer's room might start in the summer or spring of whatever year that was, 2018.
Yeah.
And so I had like a month that I knew was free. So that forced me to sit down and get started on Tick, Tick, Boom.
Oh, that's great.
But the way it really began, that process, was we went to the Library of Congress, and then we came back, and Lynn and I sat, before anything was written, we sat in a conference room and had these note cards, and we put the songs, all the songs from every version of the show up on a cork board, and started to talk about what we wanted in the film, and like kind of loosely how they might connect. And that's how it began, which is one of the great delights of writing a musical when the songs were already written, is you go, well, these are the points that we need to hit.
Yeah.
So let's figure out how we're going to hit them.
That's great.
And I remember on that corkboard, we had so many songs, and I told Lynn I thought we could get probably 7 of them in the movie. I was like, this is a movie. And Lynn was like, no, we can get all of them, which was like 14 or 15.
Yeah.
And we did.
That's part of the triumph.
Yes, but that was, I'll always remember that.
What do you do if you get writer's block? If you get it, how do you battle it?
Briefly. I mean, to me, writer's block is writing. It's part of the process. I wish I didn't have that, but it is part of it for me. And on everything, there are many moments where you're just banging your head against a wall. You don't know which way is forward. And I wish somebody would give me some advice on what to do. What I tend to do is I try to do something else.
Sure.
which is the hardest thing to do in the world. But take my mind off of it, go for a walk, go for a run if I'm really feeling up for that, which is rare. Go to a museum, see a movie.
It's
Like
the most subconscious answer that I hear all the time, in which letting your subconscious do some work away from the work by doing something else is the usual most common way that writers get through that. So that totally makes sense. You know, just talking thematically at its core, at a certain point, Tick, Tick, Boom presents a huge decision for every writer, which is take the big job with security, like he sees Michael do, and he, you know, makes fun of it first, but then at one point frantically decides maybe that's for him. Or pursuing your passion, even though it means that you are going to be on a different path from all your friends. It's a path that your family's not going to entirely understand, and your friends as well. But and some people give themselves a certain amount of years. Some people never stop, and it's always their side hustle. Talk about what that meant to you to keep that thematic going, because I saw that as one of the most inspiring parts of Tick, Tick, Boom for any writer in any medium, by the way, be it a novel or playwriting or composing, everything. And so, but it's tough, and it's a real thing that all writers face. And if John walked away, we wouldn't be having this conversation. No. And he changed the world in many ways by sticking to it, even though it was difficult. So talk about that thematic.
I love the way that you express that. And for me, that is the heart of the story. That's the question. That's the question at the heart of what he's talking about. Do I keep going, or do I listen to the million ways in which the universe is telling me, please stop going?
Right.
You know, like there couldn't be more signs that this is not going to work out. And how do you keep going in spite of that? And to me, it's sort of, again, it goes back to that conversation with my professor in college who said, you get rejection letters after you win a Pulitzer Prize, they're just nicer. And that's the truth, is those moments of, do I keep going or do I throw in the towel? They don't stop. And I think they don't stop, especially for a writer. And it occurred to me, I had this thought a few years ago when there was this moment when there were a bunch of writers who were getting these gigantic overall deals in Hollywood. And that was in all the news, was these huge deals. And I thought, well, first of all, great for them. But even so, tomorrow they still are facing the blank page.
Yeah.
Like that blank page doesn't go away. And for us writers, it never will. And there's no security against it. There's no amount of success that will make it easier the next time. And there's never a guarantee that just because it worked the last time, it's going to work this time.
Sure.
And that's terrifying in one sense. It's also the reason to keep going, though, is that it will always be different. And that, you know, I also remember there was a moment in my career when I had a play that was produced and it got a mediocre review in the New York Times, which is just devastating for anyone. And I talked to my agent the next day, and he said this thing that I'll never forget. He said, there will be more bad reviews. That was he was like, and there will be good ones too, but there will be more of these.
Yeah.
And I took that with me as for some reason that was comforting, that your career is long, hopefully, and filled with ups and downs. And again, you're faced with that question that John is faced with of, do I keep going in spite of everything telling me not to, or do I take the easier path?
And it's a great central question. And that's why I hope writers of any path, watch this movie. I was bummed I wasn't able to see this in theaters. And, you know, with Omicron numbers rising, there was an opportunity. I'm so grateful it was on Netflix, though, because truly the most inspiring line, I literally had to rewind it, something I never do on a first viewing, was when he says, I have to stop being a waiter who waits tables and start being a writer with a hobby.
Yes, right.
Which is like the way that he could pin success. And that was just one of my, I could not stop laughing at that. I had to hear it twice. And
that is a terrifying conundrum for any artist is, you know, am I really a writer? I keep saying I'm a writer, but like people keep giving me a look like, well, you're waiting tables, you know?
Well, so briefly, this started shooting during the pandemic and had to stop and start again. Were there any major rewrites that you did? And we could talk about them in the spoiler section, or
Yeah.
were you pretty much ready to go if the pandemic hadn't happened?
Well, I think we had shot 7 days. And we got lucky in some of the things we'd already shot. You know, we gotten to shoot inside places we otherwise would not have been able to a few months later. But there were some changes that needed to happen, mostly really kind of non-creative changes that had to happen for safety.
Right, logistics for COVID shooting.
Yeah, scenes that had taken place on the street had to go inside somewhere. Scenes that had a lot of people,
right?
You know, I mean, really simple, small things like instead of the bustling diner, it's an empty diner. Things like that, but a lot of them, you know, little things throughout, putting our heads together, thinking, how do we make this as safe as possible?
That makes sense. What was the budget and schedule?
I think it was $30 million.
Okay.
And
shows. I mean, like just great special effects.
Yes.
Everything you want to see for a musical, and musicals do not generally get budgets like that. So
no,
fantastic.
And I might be wrong because my brain is so bad at remembering.
And what was the schedule, do you think?
And now I'm trying to remember. We shot those 7 days, and then we shot, I think it was like 12 weeks, but maybe it must have been more than that. But basically like 3.5 months, I want to say. Yeah. If that makes sense. It happened in the middle of the pandemic when my brain and sense of time went out the window. So there was just a long period of, it was like, is it September? Where are we?
Right. That's right. You started shooting and then you had to put it off till September of 20 and you picked back
up. That's right.
In September. All right. Well, so I want to get into the spoiler section because I have so many deep dive questions about this. Podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify, and those of you watching this Zoom interview on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, if you have not yet seen Tick, Tick, Boom, please press pause. The movie's probably in your pocket. If you have a smartphone and you have Netflix on it, you could go watch it easily. Please do not go watch it on your phone. I'm begging you, don't do that. But you know what? It's a movie that's good enough. Even if you do, you're still going to love it. But we are getting into the spoilers now. So I'm going to save us a lot of time by at least giving everybody a quick history of this project from the best that I have pulled together. Please correct me when and where I'm wrong, and I'm always wrong. All right, Jonathan Larson, who later went on to write Rent, as we all know, and died unexpectedly the night before Rent publicly opened. He had early success, something he was workshopping in 1990 called Boho Days, which ultimately became Tick, Tick, Boom. Started as a rock musical solo show, as we know. Jonathan performed in it. It's semi-autobiographical about a young composer trying to mount a difficult musical called Superbia, which Jonathan really did work on for many years and was never able to stage for being told it was too expensive, too complicated, too convoluted. And it's about Jonathan trying to find his way while questioning if he could really realize his dreams and have a career in performing arts as something that was even possible, something tangible. Tick, Tick, Boom wound up as Jonathan's first success of his first works that were performed publicly. After his death in 1996, playwright David Auburn, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Proof, changed Tick, Tick, Boom from a solo piece to a 3-person performance, and he took the title of script consultant so that Jonathan's credits of lyrics and book would still remain. One of Auburn's biggest changes to Tick, Tick, Boom deals with taking the musical Jonathan was hoping to stage, called Superbia. In the original play of Tick, Tick, Boom, Jonathan had done Superbia as a workshop before the play Tick, Tick, Boom started. David moved it in his rewrite so that Jonathan is now nervously preparing for the workshop performance of Superbia in front of industry types that will launch Jonathan's career, or so he hopes. It is a great change to have this big workshop as a goal for Jonathan, and it allowed him to add the song Come to Your Senses into Tick, Tick, Boom, which was originally written for Superbia, and that was another great part of Auburn's changes. So there's my quick history to let people know that Superbia really was real, and it was something that Jonathan was working on for years and couldn't mount. You said that you wanted to go past Auburn's work, and I'm just going to ask really quick, did you ever have a chat before production started with what you were doing with Auburn, or did you just want to remain disconnected?
Yeah, I never did, actually.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, I guess we made the decision pretty early on to just to separate what we were doing and not, we wanted it to feel like its own thing, because that show, the version that he created, is very successful and kind of ubiquitous and stands on its own. And it felt like this was going to be something else.
I just want people to know the kind of writing that you had to do, because beyond kind of having a blank page here and not just directly adapting Auburn's work, you're also adapting Jonathan's work directly as you can.
Yes.
But I know that you went through a research phase of interviewing real life friends and family of Jonathan's, ranging from Matt O'Grady, who was Jonathan's friend, now called Michael in the play, to Ira Weitzman, who was the head of the workshop and who ends up a character in the movie because he gave you insight as to what that workshop performance was like. So tell us about how your research phase was and some of the things that you gleaned for it that you started realizing would be other note cards or other pinpoints in an outline.
We had tremendous access. The second person I met with on this project was Julie Larson. The first was Lynn. Second was Julie, who was John's sister, and really has been the keeper of his legacy since his death, and the reluctant keeper of his legacy, I would say. It's not something you would wish on anyone,
right?
But has done an incredible job nurturing his work and allowing his work out there. But from that first meeting, my hope was to try what John did in his original show, for obvious reasons. When he was writing Tick, Tick, Boom or Boho Days, nobody knew who Jonathan Larson was. He was an unsuccessful playwright writing about being an unsuccessful playwright. And so he wasn't interested in himself as a character. John in the original is a little bit of a cipher. He really is sort of an everyman. And what we were able to do, our opportunity was to make Jonathan Larson and to really lean into the fact that this was a real person. And so getting to talk to his friends and family was how we figured out who he was. And we found the common threads very quickly of, there was something that I hadn't read anywhere about him, but just came out in every conversation, which was this kind of extravagance of John's that we try to capture in the film, that there was never just people over for drinks at the apartment. There were tablecloths that people were coming over, and there were, decorations on the wall, and it was a party with a capital P, even though he had no money at all. And if they were going to go for lunch in the park, there would be a picnic basket. And there was this sense of occasion, this self-dramatization, which is very theater person, that makes a lot of sense. And we wanted to capture that. And the other thing that came across so clearly was what a great friend he was. And he doesn't give himself that kind of credit, I would say, in the original. And then the thing that changed the most from talking to people, and this changed even after the first draft that we had come up with of the script, we met Janet Charleston, who was the inspiration for Susan. And in John's version of Susan in the original, Susan is deciding whether to leave New York to move to the suburbs and get a dishwasher, or stay in New York and struggle as an artist. And that's really her dilemma, is do I want the creature comforts of suburbia, or do I want this life? And then we met Janet, who all of these years later is still living in the same rent-controlled apartment in New York, still dancing to this day, has not given up, has not done anything with her life except try to make art. And it felt like that was a betrayal of her to create this character who really just wanted literally a dishwasher.
Sure.
So we got to go back and make that character an artist in her own right, to try to do honor to the fact that John's not the only person in this film who's grappling with, how do I go on when things are arrayed against me?
That's a great change. And actually it leads into, again, that central dynamic of, should I take a regular job or keep trying the struggle? And she goes in the middle boundary between Michael and Jonathan, in which she has a job teaching dance in this version.
That's right.
In the Berkshires. So
that's right.
she's able to be paid to do what she loves, and says she's even going to have time off to pursue her own efforts. So I thought that was, wow, knowing that that's something that came in from that interview. That's a great ad.
Well, and feeling like the conflict between them, and I think this was a real conflict, not an actual conflict, but I think they would argue about this, Janet and John, was that John did want to be a success. He wanted to be a mainstream. He wanted to be Stephen Sondheim. He wanted his shows on Broadway. He wanted that recognition, and she wanted to dance in tiny downtown, dance companies.
To my knowledge, because I've just got to ask, because I've spent so much time thinking about it. To my knowledge, Superbia is basically a version of George Orwell's 1984. That's right. And the Orwell estate did not give Jonathan the rights or permission to use the story, which is right. Writing 101 mistake. Don't go develop IP you don't have the rights to.
Well, so John, out of college, his first project was going to be 1984. He tried to get the rights for years, couldn't, and then decided to write something different. But loosely,
it's in the league. It's in the league. That was like something big for him. I'm curious if you think anyone will ever try and stage Superbia.
I've thought about that question a lot because there's so much that's amazing about Superbia. And yet, the first thing you would have to do in a much bigger way than we had to do is figure out which Superbia, because that show went through so many permutations and there are so many drafts of it, and they changed drastically and radically. And in fact, interestingly, because it is this dystopian musical, as the show's development went on, and more people said no to it, the show gets darker and darker until literally the last draft that we have of it, the world ends. That's the last thing that happens. Wow. Like the whole universe blows up or something. It's a mess, and it's a glorious mess. But it is a mess, and I think, I know I, as a writer, have things in my drawer that I was heartbroken when they didn't happen at the time. And now I'm so grateful and would never want somebody to pull those out.
But it is interesting because this movie is something pulled out. You know what I mean? Like, you are going back to an author's earliest work and revising into something that he never could have imagined, even though it's still his work and it's still about him. So I don't know. I always like those scripts in the drawer. In Backstory Magazine, we have a section called Off the Shelf, where we go for writers of note and we publish scripts that they were in love with.
That's amazing.
Devastated with, never got made, that they still hope will get made. We publish them in their entirety with an interview. So that was something else that attracted me to this. And speaking of which, I had read that Jonathan wrote a screenplay for Superbia. Did you ever come across it?
That's such a good question. I don't think that I did.
Because that has me so curious.
Yes.
Your first 10 minutes of Tick, Tick, Boom are so kinetic. There's so much going on. Once somebody presses play, there's no way you could stop. And there's a lot of talk about the first 10 minutes of a screenplay, what it needs to have. Some of it is honestly a little too rigid and structured for my liking, but whatever works, works. What went into your mind in the first 10 minutes of Tick, Tick, Boom? Because it's just such a great kinetic way to draw a viewer in.
Oh, well, thank you. That's really nice to hear. That was a great example, I think, of collaboration and working with Lynn. And we knew from the beginning that is exactly the feeling we wanted. We wanted something incredibly propulsive that would pull you in, that would capture his anxiety. We wanted you to live in his anxiety, basically, in this film, which I hope doesn't scare people off who haven't seen it. But to feel, we wanted you to be in his head, which you can do in a movie, and you kind of can't do that. You certainly can't do that on stage in the same way. And so we also wanted to use the beginning to set up all of the major storylines that are happening and all of the ticking clocks, because that was really something that we found really early on, and is kind of a cliche, but I think true, that you need to figure out what is the clock on this film. And the original story does not really have a clock at all. It's much more extemporaneous. And even the 3-person show doesn't have quite the same clock. It has one clock. It has the workshop coming up, but we added this idea of Susan needing to make a decision by a certain point. We wanted to put as much pressure on our character as possible. And the other thing we wanted to do was land that first song, which is a unique issue in a musical, and feel like by the time that song ends, you're in for this journey and you're in for this character, and you understand him. And something that we definitely had to work on and tweak and constantly revisit. One thing that I was proud of with the movie and remain proud of is that John was a wonderful person and also a prickly person, and a guy who was stubborn and could be selfish and like most artists could be obsessed with the project again, like, and lose track of the people in his life. And so we always wanted to be true to that because he was a real person and not Saint Jonathan Larson who saved the American musical, which unfortunately, when you die so young, that happens. People want to canonize you. And it was something that came through in every conversation with his friends, is he could be a real pain in the ass in a loving way, but in the way that if you're friends with an artist, you probably recognize. But a lot of that first 10 minutes was figuring out, how do we capture that part of John, how driven he is, how much this workshop means to him, and still you're going to be on his side and not feel like he's being whiny, basically, about his life. Because the stakes of putting on a new musical are small in one sense. And we wanted to somehow get the audience to see how, from his perspective and from the perspective of any artist who's ever had a thing like that, how monumental the stakes are. I mean, they could not be any higher. So that was kind of our challenge there.
You added some songs, which was really cool, in which Boho Days, Play Game, and Swimming were all added. And we're going to talk for sure about Swimming later, but that was so cool that you were able to do that. And at the same time, you had to cut a couple songs. Sugar, his love of Twinkies, and See Her Smile.
It appears, yes.
And then Green Green Dress was cut basically in half. So talk about kind of that shuffle of adding new songs, taking songs out, because it was especially cool that you were going back into Jonathan's work to add some of his own other music, some of which has never been heard before.
Yes. Well, Swimming was very early on. Lynn, that song apparently had been in the off-Broadway David Auburn version and was cut in previews. And so it had been part of the original solo show in various incarnations. Sometimes it wasn't. Right. But Lynn from the beginning said there's something so cinematic about that song that on stage you understand why it feels static and repetitive to talk about swimming, but we could see it. So that felt like, oh, that would be awesome. Then there were songs like Sugar, which we felt like just didn't fit. And yet we found this tiny place where he sings a little bit of it to Ira Weitzman in the diner. Yeah. Which we found a tiny place for Real Life, which was a song that we loved, but just didn't know where it lived. And so we found this moment late in the film when Michael is singing it alone and is sort of resonating in John's head. And then, the biggest discovery was the song Sextet, which is the song from Superbia in the middle of the film, through that montage. And that was something that neither of us had ever heard before. And we went to the Library of Congress, and Jennifer Tepper, who I was talking about before, said, you guys should hear this song. It's an amazing song. I think it's the end of Act 1 in Superbia. And I just remember listening to that song, and I get goosebumps about it now to this day, and just feeling like, oh, we just found something incredible. And then when we did table reads of the script in progress, when we finally got a group of actors singing that song and learning the parts and learning harmonies and putting it up on its feet, there was this magical feeling of, this is a song that has been in the archives for 20, 30 years. Nobody has heard this song, and it's being brought to life by these, we had incredible actors doing it. And it was sort of like that felt like a moment of magic.
Well, and it's very meta too, because it's from Superbia. Like it's real. Like it's from what you're really talking about.
Absolutely.
Not making it up and inventing it. It's real. And something to point out, you just said, like, you're at the archives, and she said you should hear this song. His demo tapes are at the Library of Congress.
Absolutely.
Am I correct in that?
Yes.
That's just wild. That's so cool. That's so cool.
Absolutely.
There would be a temptation in lesser hands to have too many references and hints to Rent, and to really try and cross back and forth with, knowing that Rent was coming. You did just the right amount. There were
Thanks.
traces of it. You know, the notes that he's writing, you could see traces of Rent. One song, Glory, like you could hear just like for a couple seconds. What was the balancing act there of you tell us right in the beginning, like you get it out of the way that he's going to pass away at a young age. That isn't like a into the movie reveal for people that don't know. And it gives a gravitas to what we're seeing because it's the precious part where he's alive.
Yes.
But you didn't get sentimental on Rent. And I was so glad that you didn't, but you still pay homage to it. So how tough was that to balance?
Well, we knew from the beginning that Rent looms very large. But it felt like Rent has really gotten its due. And people know Rent and it's there for them. And so it felt like we don't want to tell that story. But what we want to suggest, I think, is it's that moment toward the end of the film when Judith Light's character, his agent, says, here's a bit of advice. I'm butchering my own words here. But on the next one, why don't you try writing about what you know? And he's left sort of looking at his crappy apartment in downtown Manhattan. And then he goes to this party, and we wanted to just hint at the idea of this is what he's going to write. This is what he knows. This is his world. And so hopefully by the end, you on some level see the tapestry of his life and see where things are going to weave together to form Rent. But yeah, we never wanted to make it about Rent. And we certainly, one of Lynn's credos from the beginning was so much ink has been spilled about Jonathan's death, so much. And this was a chance to talk about his life. And so we really didn't want it to be about that tragedy. And in fact, that the mentioning of Rent at the beginning, this is an interesting sort of process fact. That came really late in the process. That came in post. And that came...
Was that in editing then? Something that you wrote?
Yes, that was in editing, and realizing that we brought to this story the knowledge of what happened next, and not everyone who would watch the film would. And we realized that for people that didn't know that he wrote Rent and that he actually did die young, it just was not the same experience. Some of what it's sort of like if you've never heard of Mozart and you watch Amadeus, you might be less excited about it. Right. And for people that don't know musical theater, we're telling them Jonathan Larson is a great composer, but they may not know if that's true. And so we wanted to just say from the beginning, this is not a story about is he good or is he not? He's very good. This is not that story. This is a different story.
It's a great addition. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. We just published our winter issue. It has a Dune cover. There is so much stuff in it. You could check it all out in our table of contents over at backstory.net or by looking into our iPad app, Backstory. Folks, one of our favorite things to do is to post-publish. That means put new articles into the magazine after we've already published, and we're a digital magazine, so we could do that. And we just post-published two great ones. A Nichols Fellows piece that interviews each of the new Nichols Fellows from this year and also has excerpts from their screenplays. We also did a big piece on Star Wars Visions, the animated Star Wars piece on Netflix, and we went through translators to interview the directors of this great animated series, and it's a heck of a piece as well. If you've never read us before, you could test drive us and read our free issue, which I highly recommend you do. And if you like what you read, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to subscribe, I'm here to sweeten the deal. You could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That will save you $5 on a Backstory Magazine 1-year subscription. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where these Zoom interviews go, so you could see us talk. It would really mean a lot to me to have you become subscribers to my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with screenwriter Steven Levenson about his latest film, Tick, Tick, Boom. One of my other favorite parts of the movie is that we have a character. Stephen Sondheim is in the movie.
Yes.
And it's fantastic that he's a character. And it's so tragic and sad that he passed away recently. And it was just so nice. And this is also his last film cameo, because I believe you could tell us the story that it's his real voice on the answering
Yeah.
machine.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because in John's original scripts, he would go back and forth between a character named Sondheim and a character named Walter Bloom, who was his Sondheim alias. And there were a few of those. Like there was a character who was Ira Weitzman in the original, but he wasn't called Ira Weitzman. And with a lot of those people, we thought it was cool to just call them who they were.
Yeah.
And especially with Sondheim. And we were lucky enough and fortunate enough that Lynn had an incredibly intense, intimate relationship with Steve. And so he was looking at drafts of this script from years ago, and weighing in. And, he was famously punctilious and opinionated, and he always had thoughts. It was always exciting to get, you could get notes from worse people than Stephen Sondheim.
Sure.
And he saw the cut of the film, I think in September of this year. And at this point, Lynn was deep into post. I think there were like a few weeks left, basically, before the film had to be locked. And Steve's one quibble was with the final answering machine message that his character leaves for John. He says, Steve said, I wouldn't have said it that way, basically. And so Lynn said, well, how would you have said it? Steve sat down. Oh, and how would you have said it? And also, if you're going to rewrite it, it has to fit within that time because I can't re-edit the picture on the film because it's locked.
Right.
So Steve sat down and wrote something that I couldn't have written. I just don't. I could probably write my voice, I think, better than anybody else, and he could write his voice better than anybody else. And so we were both so amazed by it and loved what he said so much. And then I remember Lynn told me he's going to record it himself because I don't have the actor. And I thought, I think Lynn means he's going to record it for now, like for temp. It'll be temp in the next cut, because that's not going to work. And there were a few times in this experience where Lynn had some idea where I said, I don't think that's going to work. And I was wrong. So I think, it's sort of similar. Like if there's anyone to be wrong opposed to, it's like, Lin-Manuel Miranda.
And it also shows that pursue it, try it, see if it works. Yeah. And if it doesn't, cut it. Like you have the room to do so. In real life, Sondheim, I believe, showed up to Superbia for only the first act and left.
Yes.
And I'm glad you didn't do that in the movie because it would have devastated me.
Totally. Yes.
He was very supportive, and Jonathan he invited him to rehearsals of Into the Woods, I think.
Yeah. Before
Jonathan had even written Tick, Tick, Boom. So that was cool. I know we're going to start running out of time, but I want to get into this for a second. It's one thing to show a musical. It's another thing to make it filmic. And this is filmic in every frame. It's such an impressive debut from Lynn, but obviously your screenplay is going there as well. And the two most filmic songs, even though they're all hitting it, for me were Sunday. Obviously, you're using special effects. You're having literally the wall turned down and a million effects, and also swimming because you are throwing the actor in the camera in the pool. And just great visual things in which the whole movie is worried about turning 30. And one of the meter markers do they see in the bottom of the pool is a 30. And the meter markers turn into musical notes. It was beautiful. Tell us about getting scenes like that on the page.
Yeah.
Where so many things are happening in addition to the music, and you need a description for them. And I know that some of it comes from collaborating with storyboard artists and production designers and getting things on its feet. But tell us how those two scenes in particular looked on the page.
Well, I think a lot of it was helped by working with a storyboard artist for sure. But it is true that your job, I think, as a screenwriter is to lead the director, the department heads, the actors, everyone who's reading the script through the film. And that means visually walking them through what each of these sequences is going to look like. And with a musical, on stage, you have this incredible luxury of somebody can step down stage, a spotlight can come on, and they can sing for 5 minutes, and you're wrapped, and nothing needs to happen. And on film, you can't do that. On film, it's not because it's not really in front of you, it's not as engaging to watch somebody sing. You need stuff to also be happening, and you need,
right.
I thought of musical numbers. I didn't realize I was thinking of them this way, but in hindsight, they're like writing action sequences, where each one needs to be specific and precise, and both within the language of the film, but also unique, and we wanted each of these sequences to earn its keep, really. And so that meant really drilling down and figuring out what each of these sequences was going to look and feel like, and how it was going to be different than other parts of the film. With Sunday, we always knew that it was going to transform somehow magically into this moment where he was going to be, pulling all of the patrons into this final tableau. And from the beginning, Lynn said, I want to get every Broadway actor that I know to be in this. The thing that Lynn brought, and I don't know where, I forget if this came when we got into pre-production or if this was before, but he said the wall of the diner is going to come down. And so that was something that I didn't, for a long time, I wrote it in the script, the wall of the diner comes down. I didn't know what he meant, really. But I trusted that it would be good. And then swimming, I thought of from the beginning as a montage, and as needing to have the kinetic feel of that song itself, and knowing that you want it to feel frantic in the way the song feels frantic, and to capture the intensity of exercise, for one thing, like that he really is swimming, and really, what does it feel like to be out of breath and to be pushing that hard? And he's pushing that hard, not for its own sake, but because emotionally he's stuck. And again, it goes back to writer's block, and it goes back to those moments of sheer frustration. And can we capture what that feels like? And I think in my first draft, I said, he gets the idea for the song. I knew, because there's a moment in the song itself where it feels like a moment of realization. And we used swimming as, that's not from the original. That was our idea, was to use it as, this is where he gets the idea.
Right.
And I just had him sort of sinking to the bottom of the pool as this idea washes over him. And Lynn said, what if he touched the bottom of the pool and all the notes, the tiles became notes? And again, that's another thing where, as a writer, I sort of knew what he was talking about. I had a sense, but I wasn't sure if that would work. I wasn't sure. But I absolutely love that moment.
I mean, like, it's a great scene because he's trying to overcome writer's block, and he's doing exactly what we're talking about, in which he's getting away from being able to write. I mean, this is moments after he's finally able to sit down and write, and the power goes out in his building. And
that's right. Yes.
Which was another favorite moment in the movie.
Oh my God.
And I had read that was actually the pool that Jonathan used to swim at.
Yeah, that was one of the there were a lot of weird, serendipitous, wonderful things in the film. And that was one of them.
There's so many cameos in Sunday, and I know that it's been covered in different parts of the press. I'm going to say that my favorite cameo in the movie, though, was not in Sunday. It's when he's looking through the newspaper and he sees Eric Bogosian's Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, an ad in the paper, which is just such a great play. And you could hear it on Spotify. I love Eric Bogosian so much. So that was my favorite non-actual physical cameo.
Yes.
What was something that you had to cut? What was something that was cut for time that you miss or fans of the film might like? And what was
Green Dress is a great example of something that it came exactly where it comes in the film now, which is basically she comes up to the roof and says, I've got this opportunity. He sees the dress, and Lynn and Ryan Heffington, our choreographer, came up with this, absolutely exquisite piece of choreography for it. And it's an astonishing piece of filmmaking. It's like one of the better sequences that was shot in the film, and it didn't work story-wise. It just brought the whole thing to an abrupt stop. And
pacing.
We all felt that way when we watched the first cut. And that's when I knew, there were several moments along the way where I was like, Lynn is a real director. And that was a moment when I thought, he's going to dig in, he's going to fight, because it's so good. And when people see it, if it gets released, they're going to go, why isn't this in the movie? It's so great. But he put story first, and you have to do that every time.
One of the other great parts of the movie is, showing the world around him and how AIDS is affecting Michael, and all the friends and allies that Jonathan had in the gay community that were affected, and just New York in general at that time. And you spent exactly the right amount of screen time on it. And I'm glad that you were able to balance it, because I could see on paper how that would be tough to find the tonal balance between him finding his way in the world, finding his way with his girl, finding his career, but also, you know, this was a major part of the world around him, and it wouldn't have been right to not have had those scenes. So what
thank you. And that was
just of finding the right moment.
That was a challenge. And that was something that we took very seriously, obviously. And the truth is that AIDS was a huge presence in John's life, in the real John's real life. He had so many friends, as anyone who worked in the arts, and especially theater at that time did. He had so many friends who died young, and so many friends who were getting sick around him. And so it was this omnipresent thing for him. And we wanted you to feel that omnipresence. But what we really wanted most of all, I think, was to capture emotionally, which is always what you're trying to do in storytelling, is feel it. And so that's where we came up with this idea of the character of Freddie, who he works with at the diner, who's sick in the film, and ends up in the hospital. And that was, we wanted to find a way to get the presence of the plague essentially into the film from pretty early on. So it didn't feel like Michael's diagnosis at the end was this kind of last minute reveal, like, oh, here's something topical. Because that's not what it was. It was, and it was also, I think it's part of, and this is where I think the story is so contemporary. It's part of John's ambivalence about being an artist, is that this terrible fire is raging all around him. And what is he doing? He's making a musical. And in one sense, he argues why that's important and why that's crucial. And in another sense, he knows that it feels flimsy and trivial compared to the magnitude of the suffering around him. And that, to me, is something, as an artist today, you have to grapple with, is the world we live in, and what are you doing about it? Well, the truth is you're writing scripts, and what does that mean? And I think if you're not asking those questions, you're probably not, you probably haven't thought about it enough, because it's, this is just being a citizen in the world. And I'm not saying, I think what's so brilliant about John's approach is that he never resolved that contradiction. He wasn't a saint, and he didn't give up everything to become an activist. He wrote musicals, and they helped bring attention to these issues, and they helped bring marginalized communities into the frame, but he always knew that wasn't enough. And I respect that.
And I mean, their confrontation on the street between him and Michael, when Michael's just gripping him, saying, you have so many opportunities of things you could do that I never could.
Yeah.
That time in history, he couldn't, was just a great moment. I know we're out of time. Last question for you.
Yes, please.
What was your toughest scene, and how did you creatively rise to the challenge? The scene that you found yourself rewriting over and over again. What was the one that haunted you, or still haunts you to this day?
Well, it's funny, because I find this as a writer, like, the hardest scenes to write are often not, like, the scene with Michael on the street was not a hard scene to write. And really, like, the scene with Susan and John having a huge argument in their apartment was a really easy scene to write. It was the scene where you introduce John at the top of the film, working at the diner and meeting the people around him. It's those early exposition scenes where you are kind of being a surgeon, and you have to very carefully, surgeon, I don't even know the right metaphor, but you're so carefully laying out the right bricks, and just the right amount, and not too much. But you have to set the table correctly. And that's when, as a screenwriter, you do feel like a mathematician, or where you just have to be so painstaking. So that, I think, was the scene probably I rewrote the most, was like him in the diner, which is not, if you've seen the film, you might not even remember the scene. And yet it's where you first meet him with his friends. It's where you introduce the idea of this workshop. It's
that first 10 pages we talked about earlier.
Yes.
It's very important. You can't mess it up.
Yes. And so those scenes, I find, are the ones that you end up writing and rewriting, which is surprising. It's those deep, big emotional scenes that, for me at least, are sometimes come really easily.
Well, look, you've been so generous with your time. I love all the heavy lifting that you had to do to make this version of Tick, Tick, Boom, which is just utterly fantastic. Steven, thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a great chat.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Steven Levenson for being so generous with his time and chatting about his latest film, Tick, Tick, Boom. Of course, while you're surfing around online after you've finished watching or rewatching Tick, Tick, Boom, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. We recently published our winter issue, which has a Dune cover, and there is so much cool stuff in it. And I hope you check out the table of contents over at backstory.net or via our iPad app, Backstory. And, you could read us on a desktop or laptop or our iPad app. So there's a ton of ways to check us out. And we always like to post-publish cool articles too. And we recently did a big one on the Nichols Fellows, and you could even read excerpts from their screenplays along with interviews with them about their Nichols Fellowship scripts. And you could also read a great piece on Star Wars Visions with the directors. We went through translators to interview the Japanese directors of these amazing Star Wars anime pieces, and it's a very in-depth article as well. Of course, if you've never read us, you could test drive us and read the free issue. And if you like what you read, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to, I'm here to offer you a discount coupon code of SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where these Zoom interviews go, so you could watch us chat. It would mean a lot to me to have you become subscribers, so thanks for considering. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2022. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to reach out to me, you could find me on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith or as Backstory_mag. It's those same two accounts for Instagram, actually. Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. I have a Facebook fan page you could reach out to. And also, you could email me anytime you want at backstoryletters@gmail.com. That inbox gets a little busy, so it might take me a heartbeat to get back to you, but I love hearing from everyone, so I'm always happy to respond. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A podcast, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.